So thank you for joining us today, Suzanne.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Good. Okay. So I'm just going to give you some early results from the Mother Tree Project. This is a project that looks at how to regenerate Douglas fir forests across a climate gradient and protect carbon stocks and biodiversity. The designs of the experiments, which looks at climate and tree retention, is based on our early research on connections in trees through mycorrhizal networks. And that early research showed that big old trees are the hubs of these networks where fungi link the trees together. And so we call these mother trees because we found that they're facilitative to natural regeneration. And so we wanted to test whether this was true in harvesting settings and whether protecting these old trees also protected carbon stocks and biodiversity. So the design has 3 levels to it. So the first is climate. So this covers a broad climate gradient from hot, dry forests, Douglas fir, to cool, wet forests. There are 5 retention levels, from a control to 60% group retention, to 30% group retention, to 10%, which is like a seed tree, to clear cutting. And then across this, we have planted a range of genotypes as well as species. And the idea of the genotypes of Douglas fir is that we're using assisted migration and testing about 9 genotypes per location, each designed around the location. This map just shows the range of the forest that we're looking at. And you can see it covers the range of interior Douglas fir, and we're expanding this into the coast as well. And on the right, you can just see the range of the forest types from cool, wet up at John Prince, which is the northern limit of Doug fir, to hot, dry near the border. So just some early pre-treatment results. We found some really, I think, fascinating for me, is that, obviously carbon stocks are increased with precipitation and declining temperatures. And so that's expressed in the summer heat moisture index. So we see this strong trend so that the more fertile forests have 2 to 3 times the carbon stocks of the drier, hotter forests. The other interesting thing to me is that the below ground stocks, which are in the brownish colors, represent about half of the carbon stocks of the entire forest. And I know this varies across Canada, where you have increasing carbon stocks in the boreal forest in below ground, but here in the West, it's generally a half and half across the board. And interesting, these carbon stocks were correlated with tree species richness across this natural gradient, and others have found in experimental studies that is true, and it's because of, I think, niche differentiation. So these are the retention treatments, from control forests to 60% retention to 30%. And that 60 was with thinning from below, 30% in clumps, seed tree, and clear cuts. And just our early results showing that generally from the uncut control to the clear cut, we see as you take away trees, you get this, generally correlative decline in carbon stocks. But so that makes sense in the above ground world. Of course, you see, we lose also snags, dead standing trees with clear cutting. You can retain those with increasing retention. But I think that the most interesting thing for us is this change in forest floor carbon. So what we're seeing is that compared to the control, we're losing across the board. And there was no significant difference between these treatments or across all the climatic regions. We're seeing a 60% loss in forest floor carbon. And this is surprising to us and is worthy of more investigation. This is from the clear cut on the left, sorry about that, to the control on the right, but this just generally shows species diversity. And what we're losing the most of are the lichens and mosses, whereas, and also tree species richness as well. The shrub and herb community, of course, that diversity, when you look closely at that, there's all kinds of nuances in there. I'm not going to talk about that, but what we're most concerned about are losses in mosses, lichens, and old growth dependent herbaceous plants. For regeneration, what we're generally finding is that we're seeing increased richness and density of regeneration as we get increasing retention. And that's true across the board, whether you're in a wet environment or hot and dry environment, although in the drier environment, it's a much more muted response. Now, when we look, and this is about the migration of species. When we look at the retention effects on regeneration across these different the aridity gradients, we're finding some general trends. And I'm just going to show you one site. This is John Prince. And in this case, the local seed source is the green one. The blue is from a wetter, cooler climate. And then these other bars, the warmer colors, are from drier, hotter climates. So generally what we're seeing, and this is true pretty much in most of our climatically stressed environments, is that the 30 to 60% retention levels are actually seem to be resulting in greater survival of seedlings that are migrated from these warmer climates. And so what I think is going on is that the old trees are providing a facilitative effect. They're providing protection for the seedlings by shade or reducing frost, or, and we're trying to get at that mechanism in our further studies. But I think this is really interesting because really, as you go into these stressful environments, the general harvesting practice is clear cutting. So I'm just going to conclude, I know this is really fast, is that what we found is that carbon stocks are increased naturally with precipitation or increasing humidity. And this is correlated with tree species richness, which I think is because of niche differentiation. That below ground carbon pools are roughly equivalent to above ground carbon pools in these interior and coastal Douglas fir forests. The above ground carbon stocks are reduced to about 5% with clear cutting. And then the amount that's left increases with the increasing retention levels. It's pretty correlated with just the amount of trees that you retain. But below ground, the picture is very different, that the forest floor carbon is reduced by 60%, regardless of the climate or the retention level. And so we're investigating this further with more studies this summer, because I think, previous studies have shown that, and meta-analysis, that the reductions are less than that it's more like 20% reductions. So we're trying to figure out what the heck is going on here. What I am thinking is that it's because of the change in machinery, the larger machinery, and the use of feller bunchers, and then multiple pass systems, and this is impacting forest floor. So we're investigating this in coastal and interior Douglas fir ecosystems this summer in more detail. From a species diversity point of view, which of course is correlated with carbon stocks, the most affected functional groups are mosses, lichens, and forest-dependent herbs, and these increase with retention levels. Richness and diversity of regeneration also follows this, that we're getting the best natural and migrated species diversity and survival under these intermediate retention levels, especially in the more stressful environments. And so in conclusion, to answer the question to this overall session, partial cutting does appear to mitigate carbon emissions from the forest sector. So thank you very much.
Thanks for being here. I'll be presenting results from a long-term field study and trying to use findings from these to answer a socioeconomical question, which is, can reducing logging intensity in North Temperate rainforest help reach emissions reductions target? And thank you to Suzanne Simard, who perfectly set up our our talk, because although it's a different ecosystem, we're looking at a lot of the same carbon pools, but it's over 26 years, so it gives a bit more of a not a complete picture as far as like ecosystem spans go, because it's quite a more localized study, but through time we have 26 years. So under the Paris Agreement signed in 2015, so 196 countries, including Canada, committed to come up with their own plan to reduce emissions. And but by 2008, BC had already its own carbon fuel tax, and in 2022, this tax reached $55 per ton, which is by far the highest in North America. And in April of this year, Canada announced its emissions reduction plan, which is a sector by sector path for Canada to reach its net zero emissions by 2050. However, I was looking into this, and when I clicked into the nature and climate solution sector, there was basically no mention of forest management, which I thought was interesting and unexpected to me. But on the eve of this poll, on the eve of the release, there was a poll by Ecos that showed that the vast majority of Canadians want the federal government to adhere to its emission reduction plan, which is good, but they're also in favor of improved forest management or conservation. So that was perplexing to me why that wasn't mentioned. Well, in the last century, there's been many attempts to incorporate multiple values into forest practices, such as partial harvesting for biodiversity and more recently for carbon sequestration. But still today, most of what we see in Canada is clear cuts. So why is that? Well, likely because it's deemed more economical than clear cut, or clear cuts are deemed more economical than partial harvest. So here we investigate if retaining mature trees is a viable alternative to clear cut if the net flux from the whole ecosystem is valued. Our study is based in 175 and 365-year-old Western red cedar and Western hemlock forests, which are considered mature and old-growth forests. The site is located in the Date Creek Silvicultural Study System. It's a large-scale silvicultural experimental trial of about 4,000 hectares in total. It was set up in 1992. It has 16 stands of about 20 hectares and 4 harvesting treatments. It now has 400 permanent plots, and there were 4 major survey years for up to 26 years. And these 16 stands, there's 4 replicates of 4 harvesting intensities, which are 0% harvest, which is control, and then 30% volume removed, which is important to distinguish from Suzanne's talk because she speaks of retention, and here I'm speaking of volume removed. 60% volume removed and 100% volume removed, which is clear cuts. And in those patches, these photos were taken right after harvest, and these patches were planted. Also, between those patches and the 60% volume removed, there was also single tree selection, and this is also how it was harvested in the 30% volume removed. So the pools that we look at are the same as the ones in Suzanne's talk, which are coarse woody debris or lying dead wood, forest floor and mineral soil, live and dead trees, and then also we've added the harvested wood products, which were estimated from the timber marks, and then we use the volumes basically that were on logging trucks, and we converted those to harvested wood products using a model from Karen Diamond. And what did we find? So each panel represents a harvesting intensity. On the x-axis, there's time after harvest, up to 26 years. And on the y is carbon, which is megagram per hectare. And the different panels represent different carbon pools. So if we run through these panels clockwise, you can see that at 0% volume, so the intact forest, the carbon stocks increase over time. And the 30% volume log, they also increase over time, reaching break-even point, which is the red line, dashed red line here, which indicates carbon pre-logging, basically. And this is also due to, as you can see, this brown band, which is the carbon in the wood products. And for 60% tree removed, we see that the carbon stocks almost reached break-even points within 26 years, while there's still a massive gap in the clear cuts. I'm not going to talk too much about the forest floor, but as you can see, they do seem to recover over time, but this is also a different ecosystem. This here is the percent volume logged in each of the 16 stands. So this is on the y-axis, and on the x-axis, and on the y-axis is the net flux, which is megagrams of carbon per hectare per year. So there's a clear increase in carbon flux as you increase logging intensity. And if we look to see where break-even point is reached, it's about 27% logging threshold. So this graph summarizes the previous graph, which shows that no harvest is a clear and strong sink of carbon dioxide, and clear cut is a strong source to the atmosphere. This is within 26 years, and light and heavy partial harvests are kind of in the middle, with reaching break-even point and almost reaching break-even point during this period. So I'd like to talk to a little bit, this is a little bit out of context, but one of the strong emissions that we found, one of the reasons for strong emission, for the emissions that we found, were basically what we call remainder carbon, which is missing carbon. So the year after harvest, we looked at all the major carbon pools, and the ones that were hauled out of the forest through the logging trucks, but there was a discrepancy. There was missing carbon. So this missing carbon, this is plotted against the harvested wood products, which you can see that in most of the stands, there was more missing carbon or remainder carbon than what was found inside the harvested wood products. So we can assume that this was harvest residue or harvest waste, which were slash piles and burnt. So this is definitely an avenue where emissions reduction can happen. And this is the last graph, which shows how carbon pricing changes the value of each management price. There's a lot to unpack on this graph, so I'll go step by step. On the x-axis, we have the carbon price, which increases continuously, but I do outline on the top here of 3 different mechanisms to price carbon, which is offset, which is like a voluntary forestry offsets, or the tax that in this case was the BC tax at the time of the study. And then the social cost of carbon, which is the total cost of the damage caused by climate change to society, which is $65 per tons of CO2. So as we increase the carbon price, we see there's, first I'd like to explain why the clear cut is a flat line. We use this as the business as usual, so the reference line, so everything is relative to clear cut. So we assume that clear cuts are the business as usual scenario. So the first thing we see is that if we don't value carbon, so if the value of carbon is 0, clear cut is much more profitable than partial harvest. But as we increase the value of carbon emissions or carbon flux, we see that at certain points, partial harvesting becomes more economical than clear cuts. And for a heavy harvest or 60% removal, this is $29 or $26 per tons of CO2. And for 30% removal, this is $39 per tons of CO2. And a surprising finding is, you can see up here, is at the social cost of carbon, keeping forests intact is one of the most valuable or economical options. So in summary, the next 30 years are crucial for reducing emissions. And within 30 years, as we've demonstrated, clear cuts are strong sources and intact forests are strong sinks of carbon dioxide. And while partial harvests can reach break-even points, we found that there was important emissions from the remainder carbon, so that's something that could be addressed. And also, only once we valued CO2 did partial harvests became a viable alternative to clear cuts. And then finally, fully or partially retaining mature trees in productive temperate forests can help meet 2050 net zero targets while providing socioeconomic benefits from forest harvesting, but only if the emissions from forests are valued, which currently are not in BC. Thank you.
The previous talks are actually the best introduction to what I'm going to be speaking about today, and I can probably zoom through a little bit of my original intro. So I'm going to just be talking about how we can use a modeling tool to understand the carbon implications of partial cutting. So I am a research associate with the Bulkley Valley Research Center. We're a not-for-profit research organization, but we have close collaborations with all sorts of different groups. And the history of forest research at the BVRC has been closely tied to the Ministry of Forests here in BC, where I'm speaking to you today, where I'm on the unceded traditional territory of the Gitumden clan of the Wet'suwet'en Nation. So I'm really fortunate to be able to work closely with Erica Lillis, who's the Ministry of Forests silvicultural and forest researcher here. And we also have a couple of technicians, Leah and Ingrid, that are working with us now that are really helping us move forward some of this work on SRT and forest ecosystem modeling. So yeah, there's really no point in going through some of these introductory slides. I think we're all here. Okay, forest carbon stored above and below ground. There's a balance in forest ecosystems between what's sequestered and stored and what's decomposed, and natural disturbances can really modify that through direct emission, through say combustion and fires, or through increased dead material produced by say insect outbreaks and the like. So where forest harvesting comes in and affects the carbon balance in a forest is the removal of that live or sometimes dead standing wood, and reducing the area that's actually actively sequestering and storing carbon, as well as the pulse in the dead materials, the slash piles that Michelle was just talking about, and sort of that missing carbon pools. And then we also have the harvested wood products that Michelle also talked about really well. As Michelle also mentioned, clear-cut harvesting is still the dominant form of harvest in British Columbia, but there's been a long history of interest in partial harvesting, and that interest has come back again, really in response to trying to better manage forests for multiple values, whether that's timber, carbon, wildlife, or other. So one of the challenges of integrating partial harvest into our timber supply or our forest management is the ability to forecast and predict how those forests are going to change over time, and be able to tell us something about the long-term values, again, whether it's timber or carbon or other. The challenge there is that we need to be able to predict not just the cohort of newly planted seedlings in a partial harvest system. We also need to model forward in time the retained trees that are left behind after forest harvesting. And many forest models that are used, there are obviously a ton of models available in this world, and many of them probably have that capacity, but some that are used in say growth and yield and timber supply don't necessarily have the ability to have multiple species in different cohorts, structurally complex kind of stands. So I'm going to speak to you about a model that does do that. And so it's called Sortie, and it's an individual-based, spatially explicit model of stand dynamics. It evolved from the gap dynamics models in the mid-1990s from work with by Steve Pakula and Charlie Canham. And a lot of the model development was really happening in the northeastern US at that time. So some of the features of Sortie as a model is that it's more on the process-based end, in that we have functions that define the establishment, growth, and mortality of trees in space. These trees interact with each other and grids of resources. Often we use light as the main resource that they are interacting with. And we are able to locate that forest in the world, based on latitude and how the sun might change depending on where you are, and things like climate. So if we think about how Sortie could be applied in the context of partial harvesting or removal of some trees, but not all trees, the strength is that it is able to capture both of those trees that remain on site and how they might release and respond to the newly available resources of light, as well as tracking the established planted seedlings or the natural regeneration that comes in. Sortie is an incredibly flexible model, and so we use it in British Columbia, but some of the most recent examples of Sortie applications are actually from all over the world. And so right from the Sierra Nevada in California, the Mediterranean forests of Spain, and then a lot of work in the mixedwood boreal of Quebec. And so I want to highlight in this talk how we can use Sortie to estimate carbon of forests after a partial harvest. And it's actually a pretty straightforward task, because we track and grow individual trees. We are able to just directly apply the biomass equations that have been estimated for our tree species in Canada. And so we don't need to interact with any other carbon model. We can just directly calculate carbon from a Sortie output. So I just wanted to speak briefly about the history of how Sortie came to British Columbia. And I think Michelle's talk was, again, a really great introduction, because it is, in fact, the Date Creek silvicultural trial that really initiated the idea for Dave Coates. So Dave was a longtime silvicultural researcher based in Smithers, and was instrumental in initiating the Date Creek silvicultural trial, which is that partial harvesting system. And what happened was he began asking questions, or people were asking him questions about what are these stands going to look like in 20 years and 50 years and 100 years. And he didn't necessarily have the tools at his disposal to answer those questions. So working with Charlie Canham at the Carey Institute and one of the founders of the Sortie model, they brought it to BC and spent the next many decades parameterizing the model, making it work for the ecosystems in our area, and particularly introducing all of the different harvesting interfaces that we now have as part of Sortie, because that's what the application that Dave was mostly interested in. So we have parameterizations for the subboreal, which is sort of like the southern boreal, kind of mixed temperate boreal system, as well as the interior cedar hemlock, which is the system that Michelle was talking about, and that's an interior temperate rainforest. So what we have been working on is trying to take advantage of some of the long-term silvicultural trials that were established in the 90s across BC in a wave of interest around partial harvesting. And we're using them to actually validate Sortie as a model to capture carbon. So it's not something that's always done, but we have the potential to do that here. And so it's a really good opportunity to see how well Sortie is performing in this particular context. So we have two trials at our disposal here. So not a huge sample size to be validating a model with, but at least we have something. And so we're using the Date Creek trial, which is in the ICH, that interior temperate rainforest. And then we have Summit Lake trial, which is in the subboreal. One of the things that we've been working on a lot for the past few years is to really build up the capacity of working with R and Sortie. And so we've developed the R Sortie package. which allows us to interface with Sortie, which is a C++ program that you typically would interact with in a GUI. And it's allowed us to really upscale the amount of runs and the complexity of our runs in Sortie. So for instance, we've just done some work where we had to get 75 plots quickly made and run, and that was really easy to do with our Sortie. And the other neat, I guess, application has just been that we can actually use some of the spatial capacity of R and translate the real spatial design and structure of a gap cut and apply it and translate that into Sortie's world. So that's been really advantageous. So we'll just really quickly look through a couple of the results around how well is Sortie performing as a model of carbon from partial harvest. And generally the answer is pretty good. So in the subboreal, looking at the Summit Lake trial, we see that across treatments, it's capturing the carbon pretty well. And this is compared to the field data that was collected at different intervals over time in different permanent plots. And so if we just look at the observed, which is the field data, compared to the predicted, which is the Sortie data, we see that there's generally a good fit across treatment. And the same is true in the ICH. There's obviously some variability and some things we're looking to potentially improve, but the main story is just that it's generally performing pretty well and capturing that carbon over time in these different retention treatments. So I'll just end to say there's obviously more carbon pools than what I've just shown. So, Suzanne and Michelle spoke about the importance of all of the carbon pools in these forests. And so far I'm just showing the live trees. But Sortie does have the capacity to track and calculate carbon in the deadwood as well. So that's where our focus is right now, is to test and calibrate as much as we can some of the standing and down wood dynamics in the model. So there's some snag dynamics and we can watch things decay over time. And we're also doing more work across larger edaphic and climatic gradients as well. And I think that is all I have to say.
So hi, everyone. Pleasure to be here today. I'm not calling in from Borneo like our keynote, Dr. Betts, but I am live from a 3-year-old's bedroom, my daughter's room, where my home office is in lovely Halifax, Nova Scotia. But speaking of that keynote presentation, I'm glad it did touch on the triad, because today I'd like to talk about some ongoing work, which is some modeling-based analysis and research, as well as actual implementation here in Nova Scotia around the triad, and in particular, the carbon implications of the triad. So just a very brief bit of context on Nova Scotia, just to help set the stage so we understand sort of the jurisdiction that I'm describing these changes in. Nova Scotia, small province, east coast of Canada, around 5.5 million hectares in size, mainly forested, and with about 3.3 million hectares of that being the working forest. We've heard a lot about Western Canada, in particular BC so far, and in sharp contrast to that province and much of Canada, Nova Scotia is only about 1/3 crown land, and in fact, over half the province's forest is small private woodlots, which makes any kind of rollout of something at this broad regional level, like triad functional zoning, a bit more challenging, but a necessary reality here in Nova Scotia. And we have around 882 megatons of CO2 in the living forest biomass in Nova Scotia. The harvest levels in Nova Scotia have been somewhat in decline, especially with recent mill closures since the recession, now actually around 2 million cubic meters, though mostly at the provincial level from even-aged management systems, although on Crown land that is changing, and in particular is changing quite a bit right now, which I'll get to in just a moment. And what I'm going to describe to you today is some results of some modeling work we've done recently on implementing the triad and the carbon implications of doing so, but also just more of a discussion of some of the implications and questions that have been arising for us as we've been on this stage. So less of a traditional research presentation, but a lot of head scratchers and thinking to put forward as we move forward on this path of implementing the triad. So the modeling that we have done so far in Nova Scotia is, now our carbon research program has a variety of different models that we use, and so obviously some field-based components as well. Our strategic level model, however, that we use in this analysis work is coupled with the carbon budget model of the Canadian forest sector, CBM CFS3. I suspect many people here will be familiar with that model. It's used in the national inventory, and with that we model live biomass in the forest and all the dead organic matter, including soils. And then we also track carbon in harvested wood products and their decomposition rates according to international standards. All of this being driven by provincial inventory data, research data, and growth and yield information to drive the modeling. And then a necessary piece to set the political landscape in Nova Scotia and the current state of our forest sector and its direction, to understand why I'm talking about triad today and carbon in the triad. And that would be a recent independent review of forest practices that occurred in 2018 in Nova Scotia, driven largely by public pressure, in many ways focused on reducing clear cutting. So very topical for today's session. And in this independent review, which our government has adopted here in Nova Scotia and working to implement, there's a number of recommendations all themed around taking more of a biodiversity focused approach within the forest sector in Nova Scotia that really draws from ecological forestry, and in particular implement the triad method of functional zoning within the forest sector, like Dr. Beck described earlier. So that being areas of no forest management at all that are entirely focused on conservation and to some degree, recreation and other forest values. Areas that are very much focused on fiber production, that's the high production forestry, what's meant to be the smallest of the three zones in the triad, and then the much broader landscape of the ecological matrix, which balances these two aspects of biodiversity conservation and forestry with other forest values, largely dominated by partial harvesting. And so the first question that often comes to mind when we start talking about the triad with carbon, or potentially with other things, but with carbon in my world is, well, which one's better for carbon? So I try and steer away from that kind of narrative, where I think we need to consider each zone on its own and the trade-offs that exist between carbon, wood supply, biodiversity, and all the other forest values that are a reality in when there is a forest sector in a given jurisdiction. Just like trying to avoid the pitting of the carbon storage versus carbon sequestration debates that were often much more common probably a few years back. But really the end game here with the entire land base is to remove as much carbon from the atmosphere and store it for as long as possible, which is how we can mitigate global climate change. So to that point, the first zone I'd like to talk about is the conservation zone of the triad, where in many ways I don't think carbon should be the first consideration, where here it really should be, protected areas and biodiversity conservation is the key. And the carbon will, to some degree, take care of itself here, where if we're going to protect these areas, we can hope and assume that forest will restore, or depending on what a state is, continue to function in a way that just maximizes the amount of carbon that can be stored on the land for that type of ecosystem, and is not managed for any kind of forest product. And what that might look like, if we look at some of our national parks, will depend on the condition of the forest when it's protected. Kejimkujik National Park, a quite young forest that was protected in the 60s and paints a pretty good carbon picture over the past several decades, and is now just reaching a more mature area. But of course, contrasted to the Cape Breton Highlands, which were really hit hard by the last spruce budworm outbreak. And, we are staring down the barrel of another one potentially. And that does bring the question of other kinds of management that may or could be suitable, or at least need to be considered for carbon in the conservation zone of the triad, which is whether that be fire suppression or treating for forest pests or whatever else that may be, but natural disturbances being the overarching key point there. Next to certainly the most contentious zone of the triad, which is the high production zone, focused on doubling at least yields of wood production with a real focus on fiber, and with nutrient management regimes and multiple silvicultural treatments, whether that be commercial cleaning, competition control, and so forth. And we built our carbon yields for that from long-term silvicultural research trials here in Nova Scotia that date back to the 70s for analysis when we were working with the implementation of the triad here. At the broader landscape level, we can say that there's typically less carbon in the high production zone in some compared to the ecological matrix, and especially, of course, to conservation, and especially in dead organic matter. But there are higher yields of longer lived wood products, where the focus here is more around long-term soluble products from this area. And if we do look at the stand level, or looking at our individual carbon yields, which drive the further modeling that we do here, and just as a white spruce as an example, we can see that all the way up to tracking all the carbon in the forest, including that is removed from the forest and converted to a product, and including that is emitted from whether it be from the mills or whether it be from wherever else, of course, from decomposition. And we see that at this stand level, this zone can be one of the effective approaches to handling carbon. But of course, there are some serious uncertainties around sustaining carbon storage in the really large pools of carbon that exist in mineral soils and in the forest floor as well, which will be a key area of future research as we go forward and may require amendments. Then we get to the ecological matrix, where we're looking at this partial harvesting dominant approach to this zone, typically more carbon on the land base, and again, especially in dead organic matter, including in the soil, as I mentioned. Also more structural and species diversity from a resilience and climate change adaptation point of view, which is important. We can't forget adaptation is with this strong focus on mitigation here. And from the point of view of modeling, it's a lot harder to model. And funny that the conference platform looks like a video game, where I sort of make the comparison of modeling even age plantation carbon compared to, for example, irregular shelter woods and other multi-entry uneven age management systems is like, level 1 of a video game versus getting to the boss at the end of the video game. But we did use CBM CFS3 for that, and thanks for that earlier talk, Elena. And we are beginning research on individual tree-based models or tree-less models to better handle these uneven age systems and their carbon dynamics. But for this current work, we used CBM to essentially its functions to restructure several cohorts with these multiple entry systems. Irregular shelterwood being the dominant silvicultural system to replace clear cutting in Nova Scotia is what we predict based on our inventory conditions. And of course, tracking all the dead organic matter according to those management systems. And we see here, just similar to that last graph of looking at net biome productivity, that it is a net sink for most of the rotation. Not as much though as the high production forestry based zone at that yield level, but really the rubber hits the road at the implementation level, the landscape level. And we can look at that from a modeling point of view of what the actual carbon outcomes going to be in terms of what the atmosphere actually sees. And some critical considerations that we have and are starting to discover as we proceed in implementing the triad here and start to conduct more research on the carbon dynamics is, for example, when you start accounting for your carbon. So this is true in all areas, but in high production forestry, for example, if we look at a yield curve, we're starting at age 0 with no carbon in the living forest, whereas in the implementation of high production forestry, that often, or maybe even most commonly, won't be the case, where there will be some initial harvesting to establish a plantation, and that leads to a carbon debt that will take some time to repay. These here are 100-year model runs from, we coupled the CBM with Woodstock, wood supply model in Nova Scotia. Some may be familiar with it. And then with the ecological matrix, we also need to consider the management history that's going to be driving the past 50 years, going to be deciding the outcome, the carbon outcomes of the next 50 years in many ways, where the ecological matrix, which I've somehow lost the legend of this figure here, which is in light green, conservation in red, and high production in blue. It's the dominant, most geographically spread out area of the triad here. But also we're starting in this particular land base where we did the modeling, we're starting with a young forest. It was more intensively managed historically in a more even-aged system. And we can see that starting point leads to a lot of the carbon outcomes in the green line of the ecological matrix, which is pretty considerable carbon benefits and leads it to it being the dominant carbon sink across the triad at this particular scale and this land base and with these disturbance regimes. And that's going to change very much depending on where we are in the province. And another critical question that I think could be almost forgotten at times, especially, you know, with my earlier slides looking at stand level yields of carbon. Now we're looking at landscapes. The other question is, there is reduced, in this case, harvest levels considerably in the matrix here. And that is in this modeling scenario being supplemented to some degree with high production forestry. But the question remains that at the scale of an entire jurisdiction, you know, will there be adjustments to harvest levels or AAC, especially if you're not supplementing lower harvest levels for partial harvest with this more intensive management, and that has considerable carbon implications. If somewhere is trying to obtain the same amount of wood from exclusively partial harvest, then those kind of carbon considerations need to be modeled in different scenarios as well. Lastly, so far for us, you know, in a perfect world, we would have had, for example, irregular shelterwood trials going back 40, 50 years as well, but that wasn't the case of the forest sector back in those times. We're starting, we've got 4 or 5 new regular shelterwood trials that we've begun. We need to validate and calibrate and do new research to understand carbon across all 3 zones of the triad continuously. And we can't also forget that any of these carbon outcomes, regardless of where they are in the triad zoning, are vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And I had one more point about disturbance regimes, but I better, looking at my clock, stop there. And there's at least a minute left if there was a question now. So thanks very much. Appreciate it.
Okay, great. Thank you. And this talk was supposed to be given by Colin Bergeron, but he was unable to attend. He's moved on to a position with Parks Canada and so has been a little removed from this work, but I'm going to do my best job presenting it. And I want to acknowledge as co-authors John Spence and the late Jan Volney, who were the originators of the EMEND experiment that I'll be talking about and the originators of this work on carbon. So I'll be talking about varying levels of retention harvesting and the impacts on carbon dynamics in boreal mixed-wood forests. So the work that I'll be talking about is part of the EMEND experiment. EMEND stands for Ecosystem Management, Emulating Natural Disturbance. It's an adaptive forest management experiment that we started in 1997. It's located up northwest of Peace River here in Alberta. So here's Alberta, Edmonton, where I am now, and the EMEND experiment here in the lower boreal highlands natural region of Alberta, and this is Treaty 8 territory. And so the purpose of the EMEND experiment was to see what harvesting practices and regenerative practices would maintain biotic communities, forest structure, and ecosystem function in ways that were similar to the boreal mixed-wood landscapes that originated through natural disturbances. And so we looked at 4 mixed-wood forest cover types, which roughly correspond to a simplified version of succession, from broadleaf dominated forests, we call it deciduous dominated, mainly aspen, to aspen with conifer in the understory, mainly white spruce in the understory, to a mixture of broadleaf and conifer in the canopy, aspen and white spruce mostly, to conifer dominated. And for today's purposes, I'll only be talking about these 3 to simplify things. So I'll be talking about deciduous dominated, mixed, and conifer dominated. Okay, so in each forest cover type, we applied a range of retention harvesting levels. So the lowest was a clear cut, which was actually 2% retention because we had 2 aggregated patches left in each clear cut, as is shown here. And then 10, 20, 50, and 75% retention, and unharvested control here. And then we had some standing timber burns and some partial harvest and burns. I won't talk about those. So the retention was left largely as dispersed green tree retention, and you can see that in the pictures here. So machine corridors where the harvesting occurred, and then strips with partial harvest there, so that at the entire block level we had the appropriate level of retention. And each patch also had, each compartment also had a small and larger patch of aggregated retention. So for each of these cover types and each of these treatments, we had 3 replicates of compartments that were 10 hectares each. So in total, we have about 100 compartments on the landscape, and we have 6 permanent sample plots in each of those. So 600 permanent sample plots in total in this experiment. So these 100 compartments are distributed over a total area of 7,800. So you can see the whole experiment on the landscape here. That's 1 kilometer. So it's over a very large area. The plot selection began in 97. The pre-harvest data were collected in 1998. Harvesting occurred over the winter between 1998 and 99. And then so 99 was year 1 post-harvest. And we've been doing ongoing data collection up to about 2017 was the most recent full experiment data collection. Okay, so the carbon pools that we've looked at, live trees and shrubs, and the shrub plots include regeneration, so seedlings and saplings, then snags, deadwood, forest floor, and mineral soil components. And then for the live trees, shrub, snags, we have above ground and below ground components. And as I said, we collected data before, many years after, but I'll be talking about 3, 7, 12, and 19 years post-harvest. So quickly, the methods we use to quantify carbon for live trees by different species, and regeneration by different species, and shrubs by different species. We developed allometric equations for biomass as a function of height and dBH mostly, and separate equations for different plant components. So for the leaf, branch, stem, and roots that were larger than 2 millimeters in size. The allometric equations for biomass for the tree species have been published. So these, we didn't use the Canada-wide equations. We developed our own equations from destructive sampling on the site. And those were published by Ding Lang Xing et al. In 2019 in CJFR. Okay, then we had deadwood components, so snags, downwood, and the stumps and the roots of the trees that had been harvested. Again, we developed allometric equations for these, and for snags accounted for the breakdown of the snags over time, and also quantified the decay function. So we did this by sampling wood density over time in the stumps and roots of harvested trees. We felled trees and monitored wood density over time, and developed equations as a function of the decay class, and also sometimes went to the literature to find information on this. And then we did chemical analyses of the live trees and the dead components, and also looked to the literature to come up with values of % carbon, so we could convert from biomass to carbon. The soil component was done by Barb Kischuk and was published in 2014 in Canadian Journal of Soil Science, and I'm not going to talk about the soil component much. Let's look at the pre-harvest carbon pools. So here I have the live and deadwood components in the pre-harvest time period by each of the forest types. And as was already mentioned, the forest floor and soil component in boreal forest is quite large. I'm not including it here. What Barb found is that it didn't actually differ that much among these different forest compartments, and to the extent we have post-harvest dynamics, the dynamics of it didn't change that much among our forest types. So I'm going to set it aside for now. So we can see that the live tree component is the largest for all the forest compartments. as the bulk of the carbon is in the live trees, including above ground and below ground components here, and then shrubs and regen and deadwood is smaller. You can also see that the mixed forest and the conifer forest had larger carbon pools than the deciduous dominated forest did. And this could be accumulation over time. These are somewhat successionally older, the mixed and the conifer, and it can also just be to do with the nature of the trees that are there. Okay, so let's look at change in carbon that was associated with the harvesting. So for now, I'm gonna only be talking about the live trees regeneration and shrub component. So this is partly because this is where the bulk of the carbon was, and also because I didn't manage to finish working up the data from the Deadwood component for our most recent time period, and I wanted to focus on the longest time period possible. So this is the change in carbon in live trees, regen, and shrubs from the pre-harvest time period to 3 years post-harvest. And you can see, as can be expected, there's a net loss of carbon when you're harvesting trees, and it follows really nicely along the harvesting gradient here. So R0 is the clear cut, and then we have 10, 20, 50, and 75% retention, and R99 is the reference. And so you can see this nice gradient of carbon, with more carbon lost with the more intense treatments and less as you go to higher levels of retention. Notice here, this is the reference. So in some cases, even the unharvested forest was a bit of a carbon source in the deciduous dominated forest type, but in the mixed and the conifer, it's pretty much neutral in terms of the net carbon over this 4-year time period. Okay, so let's look at a bit more detail, looking at the different forest types here. So this is the deciduous forest, and we're looking at the change in carbon over these different time periods. So we have the different treatments here: clear cut, 10, 20, 50, 75, and the unharvested reference. And then from year 3 to 7, 7 to 12, and 12 to 19. So this is after we've lost the carbon due to the immediate effect of harvesting, what happened here after. And we can see in this deciduous dominated forest, even the clear cut very quickly became a carbon sink again. And there's a couple of anomalies here. This carbon source in 10% from 7 to 12 years, but overall, all the treatments, the forest very quickly became carbon sinks. And this is largely attributable to the very fast regeneration of aspen. So all of these forest types, which I forgot to say, is that all of these forest types were left for natural regeneration. So there was no planting of trees, and we got very good and rapid vegetative reproduction of aspen, regeneration of aspen. And also in the mixed and conifer forests, we did get some quite good regeneration of white spruce seedlings as well. And so the deciduous forest quickly turned to a carbon sink after the harvesting experiment. Mixed forests as well, largely, although a little bit different. Also, again, this very interesting 7 to 12 year time period in the 10% retention, where there was something happening there, probably some dynamics of death of the retained trees that resulted in it being a carbon source potentially, but reasonably good carbon sink developing quickly after the harvest. For the mixed forest, conifer forest, a little different. We see in each of the clear cut 10 and 20% retention at the 7 to 12 year time period, and in the 50% retention in the 3 to 7 year post time period. There was a net loss of carbon from these pools, so that's going into the deadwood compartment or potentially back to the atmosphere. So the conifer forests, it was a little different story than in the mixed and deciduous dominated. Just checking my time. Okay, so looking at overall in the time period, so if we're looking from 3 to 19 years post-harvest, the net effect, all the treatments in the deciduous forest were gaining carbon in live tree regen and shrub compartment, and the more the lower retention levels actually accumulated more carbon. So this is attributable to higher levels of aspen regeneration and growth when you have lower retention. Mixed, mostly net increase in carbon in these pools over time periods for all the treatments, except interestingly for the 75% retention, there was some loss there. And in the conifer, the clear cut actually had the greatest increase in carbon in these pools, less for the other retention treatments. And in this case, the 50% retention was actually losing some carbon. So this requires a little further look into the dynamics of these forests, what happens with the retained trees, where this carbon is going into the deadwood components, and then the dynamics of those deadwood components. But the forests were changing over time. They did experience some mortality of the retained trees and blowdown of the retained trees. And so we need to look at the components, the deadwood components, to understand that in more detail. Overall, looking at from the pre-harvest to the 19-year post-harvest period, still all of the treatments and all of the forest types ended up having a net loss of carbon in these pools. The influence of the retention treatment is sort of muted here in the mixed forest type, in the deciduous forest type, and the conifer forest type. You still see fairly strongly the influence of the level of retention, where the most intensive harvesting, the clear-cut harvesting, represented the greatest net loss of carbon from these components. Okay, so the conclusion, major carbon pool is in the live tree component as well as in the soil. In terms of the carbon pools, conifer was larger than mixed, which was larger than deciduous. The loss of carbon associated with the harvesting scales with the harvesting intensity, which we've heard before in this session. The deciduous stands became carbon sinks very early after post-harvest due to the rapid regeneration of the aspen. Overall, the retention did increase the overall carbon sequestration, especially in deciduous and conifer forests. And as I mentioned, we need to look at the dynamics of the tree mortality and the root decomposition as these become increasingly important over time. As we can see some mortality and blowdown of our retained trees here. And so the longer term dynamics of these stands after the retention harvesting will become important. Okay, EMAND has been supported over the years by many different funders and many field assistants and collaborators, and I want to thank all of them. That's it.